On behalf of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, I would like to thank you for joining this webinar on the topic Climate Change and Health, presented by Dr. Kent Pinkerton, Director of the Center for Health and the Environment at UC Davis. Dr. Pinkerton is also Professor in the Department of Pediatrics, School of Medicine, and Professor, Department of Anatomy, Physiology, and Cell Biology in the School of Veterinary Medicine at UC Davis. He studies the health effects of environmental air pollutants on lung structure and function, and the interaction of gases and airborne particles within specific sites and cell populations of the lungs in acute and chronic lung injury. He also researches the effects of environmental tobacco smoke on lung growth and development. Dr. Pinkerton serves as the Associate Director for the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, where he researches climate change impacts on agricultural health and safety. He has co-chaired symposiums on climate change and global public health for the American and Turkish Thoracic Societies, and he is co-editor of the book Global Climate Change and Public Health, published in 2014. Because this is a recorded webinar, we won't be able to answer questions at the end of his talk. However, Dr. Pinkerton has kindly offered to provide his email where you can send any questions you have. So at this time, I'd like to say thank you and welcome to our speaker, Dr. Pinkerton.
I appreciate the opportunity to present this webinar for the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health at UC Berkeley webinar. Climate change and global public health is of concern to everyone. It has been something that has been with us for more than a longer time than we actually have been aware of. I wanted to just point out again that should you have questions, this is my email in which you're welcome to send me your questions, and I will address them as I have an opportunity to do so. This is a diagram that shows the average temperature worldwide for the last 150 odd years, starting in 1850 and going to the year 2007. You'll see here that in looking at this graph that these are annual global temperatures that have been recorded since 1850. And as we follow this along, we actually see that over the past 150 years, there's been a gradual increase in the average global temperature in the world today. This is also an interesting observation that has been made through the UN World Meteorological Organization. In March of 2012, they talked about global temperature and summarized it in these two tables. I'd like to talk about this one first. This is showing actually the average temperature beginning in the year 1880. And as we proceed forward to the present period, that at this time there was a slope in terms of the average increase in climate temperature that actually has dramatically shifted since the year 1970. If you look at this slope here, beginning in 1970 and going to 2010, that the increase in global temperature is actually much more significant and much more rapid than we saw since 1880. The bar graph on the left is actually just showing global temperatures in degrees centigrade. And what is interesting to see here is that this top line here is the average temperature in the 2000s compared to 1990s and 1980s, again demonstrating this gradual but constant increase in global temperature. Studies have been done to actually look at temperature increases due to greenhouse gases. One of the greenhouse gases that we're most familiar with is atmospheric carbon dioxide. These are measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide that were taken on top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, a volcano. And what you're seeing here is beginning approximately in 1960 and going to the year 2010. And you can see that, again, the monthly means are shown in red, while the 12-month running mean is shown in this black line, showing a constant increase in atmospheric CO2 in an area of our world where there's no natural source for CO2 emissions that are occurring. What is the importance of carbon dioxide in terms of greenhouse gases and global climate change? Well, this has actually been shown in terms of what happens if we actually produce carbon dioxide as an emission of fossil fuel. This is showing in this graph the fraction of carbon dioxide remaining in the air after emission by fossil fuel burning, that it shows that there's a rapid decline initially, but by basically after 100 years, we have 33% of that original CO2 emission remaining. And after 1,000 years, we have almost 1/5 of the original CO2 emission still present. Well, rising carbon dioxide levels threatens human nutrition. This might seem rather unusual to make this particular statement at this time. However, there has been a study that was conducted by the Harvard School of Public Health, in which they basically grew grains in a condition where there was a high level of carbon dioxide, typical of what we have now, compared to a low level of carbon dioxide. And what they found when they harvested this grain, this wheat, that there was a 9% reduction in the level of protein within the wheat itself. And this is actually a study that has been repeated recently in a collaborative research project with scientists from the United States and China, where they found similar findings. So this is actually another impact of global climate change on our potential health. We have really experienced extremes in weather and in temperature in this country. In the year of 2012, the Midwestern portion of the United States experienced a very severe drought condition, in which the month of March was the hottest March ever recorded in the United States. And in July of that same year, they had the hottest July ever recorded in the United States. In fact, it was the hottest month out of the last 1,400 months, dating back to 1895. So the 2012 drought was something that was most extensive in the Midwest. And as many of you are aware, the state of California in the year 2014 went through a similar condition of extreme drought and in terms of weather conditions. So this is something that has been repeating over time. If we look at the global nature of climate change, in an area in Africa where Mount Kilimanjaro is located, this is actually showing the decrease in the amount of the ice pack on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, beginning approximately in 1910 and to the present time. We've had an 81% decrease in the amount of ice on Mount Kilimanjaro during this time, and it's predicted that basically before we reach in the next 10 to 20 years, that there will be no ice remaining on this volcano in Africa. We've also seen changes in the Arctic. The Arctic ice pack has been decreasing over time. In fact, Arctic ice has lost 40% of its volume in the last 30 years. And this chance of it occurring just secondary to natural cycles is less than 0.1%. This is showing also the ice cap over Greenland, showing in 1992 then in 2002 and 2005. And it's very clear from these satellite images that there has been a significant reduction in the ice cap over Greenland. It's not just in the North Pole, but we've also had changes in the South Pole. In March of 2002, there was a huge loss of the Larsen B ice shelf on the Antarctic Peninsula that is shown here, basically breaking off and disappearing. Again, showing there are these dramatic changes that are occurring around the globe. This was a recent photograph that was taken of the Arctic ice thickness in for this year over the Arctic. And actually you can see from this that in the last 40 years that they've been measuring ice thickness, that they have seen a constant decrease in the thickness of the sea ice, and that you can actually see the beginning formation of holes within the ice itself. But it's not just issues in our extreme polar areas, but also we're seeing changes that are occurring around the world in coral reefs. This is actually showing coral reefs that since in 1997, 98, 16% of the world's reef building corals died due to El Nino increase in sea surface temperatures. Part of this temperature increase is also due to the acidification of the oceanic waters, and that as we see acidification due to increasing amounts of carbon dioxide, that this leads to the loss of these corals through this bleaching process. We also have issues with regard to our forests around the world, but especially here in the Western United States. The climate change has actually caused a change in the susceptibility of our forests to the pine beetle itself. That this gradual increase in temperature has actually led to a greater infestation of the pine beetle into these trees. And this is just showing a vast area here in the Western United States where these pine trees have all died due to this pine beetle infestation. Another concern that we have with climate change is the increase in wildland fires. In 2009, the California Climate Action Team reported an increase in the number, size, and duration of fires that will add to the air pollution that already burdens California. In fact, from this action team, they predicted that there will be a 55% increase in the number of wildfires by 2050 and up to 128% increase by the year 2099. And we all are aware of wildfires that constantly plague the Western United States, and issues that especially have impacted on the state of California. Now, components of wildfire smoke are multiple, but what is interesting to note is that there is a tremendous amount of particulate matter that is generated. And what is shown here is just simply PM10, which is particulate matter that is 10 microns in diameter, and PM2.5, which would be particulate matter that is of 2.5 microns or less in diameter. And this is shown as a single shaft of human hair, so we can actually see the PM10, the dimensions of that compared to hair. And then if we just take one of those PM10 particles, these red dots represent the size of PM2.5. And then if we even take this further, ultrafine particles, which are defined as particles that are less than 0.1 micron, are highly numerous and generated by wildfires and other particulate matter. And then just to keep in mind, here is a single piece of beach sand, just to, again, put it into dimensions, into perspective. And so again, with wildfire, we have many greenhouse gases that are being produced, such as carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and methane, as well as ozone. These all contribute to a further change in climate. So emissions inventories that were collected by the Environmental Protection Agency show that wildfires contribute to all of these greenhouse gases: carbon monoxide, volatile organic carbons, PM2.5, and PM10 emissions into the atmosphere. So those percentages are not insignificant. The majority of emissions arise from other sources, such as vehicular exhaust, road dust, and industrial processes. But again, these wildfires do represent an important source of emission. In fact, wildfire smoke can travel. What is shown here is a map of the United States, and these red dots that you see here, especially over the state of Texas, are showing individual wildfires that broke out during a year that was just not so long ago. And what is shown here in the dark gray and lighter gray is the transport of the smoke from these wildfires up throughout the United States, especially in the Midwestern area. So even though wildfires might be confined, the transport of the particles, the particulate matter, and gases can go over very long and extensive areas of our country. So in March of 2012, the American Thoracic Society produced a work group paper on climate change and human health. This was a workshop that I had the opportunity to co-chair, in which we came to the conclusion that there is clear evidence that increasing climate change does drive respiratory disease onset and exacerbations, and that our greatest concern at this time are infants, children, the elderly, and other sensitive populations, that they would really be the first to experience the serious natures of climate change-related health problems. This is a diagram that was produced by the American Lung Association of California that talks a little bit about some of the respiratory health effects of climate change. We could begin at the top here with ozone, that we know higher temperatures lead to increased emissions and accelerate ozone formation, that we're aware that those individuals who suffer from asthma and allergy face higher levels of ozone and pollution over a longer span of the year due to climate change, and that particulate pollution emissions will rise as we have greater energy demand, and also the presence of particulates within the air due to combustion sources. Also, we're aware that heat waves will increase in length, frequency, and intensity in California as well as around the world. We're aware of wildfires, as we've discussed, that produce the particulate matter, and this is really, as climate change occurs, that we have conditions that are drier and that are lead to a greater risk of having wildfires occur. Associated with all of these changes would be an increase in hospitalizations and in premature deaths due to rising temperatures and worsening of air quality that would exacerbate respiratory conditions. And finally, vulnerable populations. We know that children, the elderly, those in low-income communities are most impacted by air pollution and will face the greatest burden. Heat waves are something that we have really learned a lot about. This is actually a few studies that have been shown, but this one in particular was a heat wave that occurred in August of 2003 in France, where the mean maximum temperature exceeded the seasonal norm by 11 to 12 degrees centigrade on 9 consecutive days, resulting in 15,000 excess deaths observed in France and 32,000 throughout Europe. The mortality due to this heat wave was age-related. It was found that 45% of that mortality was higher in women than in men greater than 45 years of age. And there was also noted increased mortality in the widowed, single, and divorced people. Excess mortality at hospitals was also noted, as well as in homes and in nursing homes, especially in areas where there was a lack of air conditioning. That was an important cause of this mortality. The deaths that were noted were related to heat stroke, hypothermia, and dehydration. Heart failure, chronic respiratory, and stroke was also markedly contributed to this mortality. And even also psychiatric disorders, especially due to depression, demonstrated increases. This is a study that is interesting about Sacramento, California. So this is something that has been monitored since the 1950s, looking at extreme heat days. These are days that are defined as being at least 105 degrees Fahrenheit. That basically in the last 25 years, in essence, in California, we would usually have in excess about 4 excursions above 105 degrees. Well, now it's known that actually that there are as many as 25 such days that will be occurring by the year 2050. And what is interesting is if you look at this red line here is basically if we don't do anything to try to control air pollution, this is the predicted number of extreme heat days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit that we would see. However, if we use the current methods for restricting greenhouse gases, and we can actually, the prediction is that we'll see far fewer of these extreme heat days if we can mitigate through lower emissions of these greenhouse gases. This is also a graph that actually shows the relationship between ozone and temperature. This is actually showing the maximum temperature on the y-axis daily, and then this is showing the daily maximum 1-hour ozone concentration in parts per billion. And so this is for Riverside as well as for the city of Fresno, both here in California. And it's very clear to see that as the temperature increases, so too does the concentration of ozone within our atmosphere. This is actually showing an old California ozone standard. We are now down at 70 parts per billion. That would be for being in compliance for the state of California, as well as for the nation itself. So again, this really does show that we do have a concern about increased levels of ozone, and we're aware of ozone as being particularly problematic in terms of health impacts. This is actually a study that was done and published in 2012 by Berman and Associates from Johns Hopkins Universities. What was done here is it was actually trying to look at the maximum ozone exceedances that were occurring, and if we could roll back, so in essence, 75 parts per billion, this would be the incidence that we would see versus 70 parts per billion and 60 parts per billion, showing that we actually could have a significant impact in terms of mortality and morbidity associated with basically just simply bringing down the concentration of ozone in our country. And this was actually shown county by county. Studies that were done by Jarrett and colleagues and reported in 2009 from UC Berkeley is just showing this when we have an increase in the 1-hour maximum ozone level in parts per billion, the residual risk of actually having higher emergency room visits and hospital admissions. So we can see that there is a direct correlation between levels of ozone and emergency room visits and hospital admissions. Another important impact of climate change is that on the pollen season, that we are very much aware that as climate change is, as we have warmer temperatures, that we have a higher amount of pollen within the air, and that the duration of the pollen season becomes longer. This was especially noted in the southeastern United States, but it's actually spreading around the country. And again, this is just simply showing the relationship of things that are going on. As we have increases in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, thus increasing temperature, that we have these effects on greater amounts of pollen, earlier pollen season start, and a longer season for pollen, which again, it directly impacts on our health. We've already discussed fine particulate matter and the fact that particulate matter has acute health effects. These are noted as increased respiratory symptoms, increased bronchodilator use for those who may have an asthmatic-like condition, increased hospitalizations that can be due to respiratory disease, either infections or asthma, bronchitis, as well as increased cardiopulmonary mortality. So these are things that were especially considered, and since particulate matter seems to have a very strong correlation to climate change, that this is, again, an increasing concern that we have, especially for California, where we see greater temperatures leading to greater dusts present in the air just simply due to the dry crustal materials as well as increased wildfires. So black carbon and climate change it's an interesting mix. This is basically where the presence of black carbon that's emitted, again, due to an incomplete combustion of fossil fuels and biomass, leads to warming simply because of the fact that black carbon in the air reflects the sunlight and actually causes an increase in temperatures just simply because it's blocking that the temperature from radiating out and becomes trapped within our atmosphere. So there's also tremendous concern about biomass and hut lung. Approximately half the world prepares their food by using biofuels or biomass burning, whether it be wood, dung, or charcoal. And it's estimated by the World Health Organization that we have about 1.9 million premature deaths each year from indoor air pollution, that this will actually increase to 9.8 million by the year 2030. So a lot of these issues are things that we have a concern of, and again, are activities where there's great effort to try to reduce the amount of biofuels or biomass burning by actually having the Clean Stove Initiative that is part of the United States, where these are trying to provide stoves at a low expense that will not require the use of biofuels in food preparation. And a lot of the issues that come with hut lung is the fact that who prepares the food? It's primarily the women who are taking care of their children. And this has been found that, many of the places where this use of wood or biofuels for cooking is in areas and homes where ventilation is not very good, and that the children are there, and that there is a tremendous amount of exposure. This is just showing cells that have been lavaged from the lung from an individual who uses biofuels for preparation of food, showing the black pigment that is associated and that is taken up into the macrophages that are present in our lungs to protect us from materials that are foreign that we inhale. So there has been a tremendous amount of work on climate change. And there is the hope that, in essence, we can work together to try to better understand how climate change is impacting on human health, on public health. And we've actually realized that there are so many things that are going on that we really have to have all disciplines and communities involved in trying to realize what it is that we can do to better mitigate the effects of climate change on our public health. One of the things that I'd like to do here in conclusion is just to summarize some of the things that we currently know about the health effects of climate change, that there is a greater heat-related illness and death, exacerbation of respiratory diseases, especially asthma, but also to some degree, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There's increased cardiopulmonary mortality, an increase in the pollen season leading to increased respiratory allergic reactions, and climate change, climate-related implications of biomass burning. There are still things that we need to learn. It's an area that is still growing, and it needs to be something that we all try to address as we go forward. I'd like to thank again the organizers for the COEH webinar series. And again, I would be happy to answer any questions by way of my email address. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Pinkerton, for that great presentation and for offering to answer any questions. We'll provide your email too in the link to this presentation. So thank you very much for your time today.